Welcome to A&A, the Access in Academia podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Pekoski-Schweer, and as part of the 2023 cohort of 3M National Student Fellows through the Society for Teaching and Learning in Higher Education, this podcast is a part of our fellowship project. The goal of this multimedia project is to share the stories of leaders on campuses across Canada widely to the many stakeholders of post-secondary institutions so that they can better adapt to and understand the student perspectives. Hope you enjoy. So, on today's episode, we'll be discussing the student housing crisis and its impact on student mental health, safety, and overall education. Our guest today is Aparna Mohan, a graduate of the Bachelor of Engineering program from Dalhousie University and the previous president of the Dalhousie Student Union. She's here today to discuss her experience with the student housing crisis in Nova Scotia and her efforts to support students at the institutional, municipal, and provincial levels. So, thank you so much for coming today, Aparna. We're just going to start off with some open-ended questions. So if you just want to tell us a bit about yourself and what drew you into student advocacy.
Sure thing. Thanks for the opportunity to be here, Sarah. I did industrial engineering at Dalhousie. I use she, her pronouns. And what drew me into advocacy was just firstly the opportunity to feel a sense of community and feel how much stronger I could be with the community backing me up, especially as I navigated the difficult transitional challenges of being an international student. And I was really lucky and felt really grateful to have such a lovely residence community on campus that I could fall back on as a safety net. And realizing that collective power and collective strength, and realizing how much my well-being, my student rights, and just my rights in general are wound up with and interdependent with that of others within the community, made me realize that we don't have to always just suck it up about certain challenges that we're experiencing, and certain barriers are only going to get worse, not better, if we just stand by and we can pool our resources to advocate. And having experienced the pandemic partway through my university degree, and experiencing the whole host of challenges that brought on for me, as well as my peers, I think that particular experience sparked a whole new chapter of my advocacy journey and took me in a particular direction that I hadn't even been thinking about as much beforehand. And it was after that I really got into university politics and interfacing with senior administration and senior decision-making bodies within the university more directly.
I don't think people give enough credit to how much of a step it is to kind of make that jump into student government. And as an international student, you don't really see that as well.
Mhm.
I don't think I'm trying to think of there's not that many international students that do make that jump into student government. So I do applaud you for making that jump. Because I do know, like,
Thank
it's my
you.
experience with NUSU, like I am, and working with other, liaising with other student unions, we don't make that, like, I didn't make that many connections, so I do applaud you for making that jump. So we're going to discuss a little bit more into the student housing crisis. So
Mhm.
do you want to tell us about what you've noticed with student housing in general with Halifax in Nova Scotia?
Right. Um, so I believe that we had about when I was in office as the president of the Dalhousie Student Union, we had about like 2,100 beds in residence, and it was meant to be. Universities are, I think, typically expected to provide housing for a certain percentage of the student population, like reliably so. And there are certain policies in place that are meant to protect the more vulnerable amongst those students who are seeking housing. Um, and often this would be first year students because they're the ones who are most in need of the stability and the security and safety net that on-campus residence provides, and making the jump from living at home to living in residence is already a big jump for them. And first year students is a demographic that I think a lot of different on-campus residences across Canada try to really cater to. In some schools, not ours, being on campus, living on campus for your first year is mandatory. What we found happen right along with the pandemic was that, all the factors were already in place to create a housing crisis, and kind of it was inevitable when you consider some of the factors and some of the increasing pressures on the city during that time. Even before the pandemic, the province had the goal of doubling its population by 2060 and was rapidly kind of increasing its ability to attract workers from both out of province as well as from abroad, especially to fill gaps in industries like healthcare, which is something we continue to experience a lot of challenges with here. And with that being one of the factors in place, as well as the fact that universities themselves are, competing for students, and also trying to keep up a certain rate of growth, especially as, post-secondary funding continues to decline or stagnate at best. These conditions were giving rise to more and more recruitment efforts and this pursuit of growth, while assumptions were being made about what supports and resources would be available. I think there were a lot of people who were caught off guard within the university by just how devastating some student housing situations were. And a lot of this was starting right at the time that I had the privilege and just unique opportunity to sit on not only the board of governors for the university, but also the Senate. So I was on basically both of the senior decision-making bodies within the university. I had experienced my own housing struggles. I had lived on campus as a senior residence assistant, and before that as a residence assistant. So I'd worked in residence life, and knew what it was like to live on campus, knew what it was like to have to evacuate residents in the middle of the pandemic, and knew what it was like to have to move several times during the pandemic and have this constant anxiety of finding a roof over my head that was affordable, given all of the different kind of perfect storm of factors that were at play. One of the other things that really influenced the housing and continues to influence the housing situation and crisis in Nova Scotia in particular, is that we've also had added pressures from a lot of people from other provinces coming here during the pandemic and seeing the Atlantic bubble, and particularly Nova Scotia, as a safe haven from rapidly rising COVID rates elsewhere. So you had, multiple populations, including the student population, competing for an increasingly limited supply of affordable housing. And, we continue to have a lot of luxury apartment buildings go up. We do see that there are empty buildings that have yet to be, populated. So it's a combination of policy issues as well as practical issues, and has really required, intervention and dialogue between all levels of government, municipal, provincial, and federal. At the municipal level, that's where we see the enforcement of things like what developers are given permits, zoning laws, how many of the units in this particular building are going to be affordable units, right? And the definition of affordable housing, according to the CMHC, is it shouldn't cost more than 30% of your income. I can probably safely tell you that most students were well beyond that threshold in 2020 and continue to be. And students, didn't have to compete as much for housing as they did before, didn't have to have so many different scenarios and plans worked out as they did before. We had international students who had already done all of the work to um, get their visas, get into the program of their choice, get everything else sorted, which already takes up so much time, and then finally be able to get to um, the matter of finding housing. And because of the complete inability to find housing, have to defer a whole semester, a semester, or up to a year to start in their program. And there were some people that were thinking about in this really tough position of, do I need to be finding housing even before I have my visa, uh, when I don't even know when I'm going to get that? Like, how can I sign on to a lease? Um, People experienced issues with inequities, particularly with pandemic restrictions in place, in their ability to navigate the housing market. The housing market is already, can be difficult to navigate for domestic students. And domestic out of province students at the time were disadvantaged by the fact that they kind of had to sign on to contracts sight unseen, or at most through a camera. They were also deprioritized in comparison to, people who could do in-person visits and just actually were already in the city. Um, this was even more exacerbated in the case of international students who, were doing all of this and didn't know, the same things to look for when doing the housing tour. They didn't have the same grasp of what affordability looks like, and what is affordable. It's really great that the IRCC, I believe, has recently updated its cost of living estimate that they use in evaluating applications for entry into Canada as international students. But up until they had done that quite recently, those figures hadn't been updated since 2015. And that's something that has been thankfully acknowledged and highlighted and resolved now. But understandably, that contributed to the way in which international students were making decisions about whether they can afford to come here, whether there are going to be conditions conducive to their study of their program of choice. We, I think, now more than ever are seeing even more precarious housing conditions. Um, During my time in office, we were able to increase funding allocated towards housing bursaries. We were able to really amplify resources related to tenancy rights. At the start of the term, we platformed and sponsored a workshop by a group called Tenancy Rights for International Students, and held a workshop, or sponsored this workshop for students to attend. And this was particularly tailored towards international students. And we found that where domestic students needed the most help was with the kind of financial side of things. So we did have a lot more bursaries offered through the DSU. We were also simultaneously using every single platform and opportunity available to highlight the depth of the issues. I have lost count of how many media interviews that I did that year that was about housing. And I remember one of my first interviews was about the student housing crunch. One of my first interviews as president was about the student housing crunch, right as classes were beginning. And it was the same reporter that had interviewed me the same time last year while I was the VP academic and external for the DSU. And we had a little moment of like, we're here again a year later talking about the same thing. And she joked that at this point, this is going to turn into a bit of its own, rather than, just having what they had originally. Was they always have this back to school, bit that they do. but the housing crisis for the second time was taking up all the space for that, and had now become like a normalized routine part of welcoming back students on campus.
Mhm.
It's not how we want to be welcoming them. Um, in terms of, policy decisions and so on, we're seeing slow but steady progress at all levels of government. Certainly, there are a lot of difficulties and complexities with what each level of government can get done because of the limitations and constraints of cooperation between all levels of government. So that's something that I did have a lot of empathy for because of, our own challenges with cooperating with so many different moving parts and units within our own university to get something done. We were trying to liaise with so many different departments, like, the International Center, for example, health and wellness, and sometimes particular faculties, and working with them to do things like delay registration dates or asking for flexibility in deferral deadlines and so on and so forth in light of the specific circumstances and challenges that students were facing. Um, we know too that many students, particularly international students, were living in increasingly just precarious and hostile conditions. They were kind of a lot of students were forced to put up with a lot more than they normally would have. Things like mold and rat and mice infestations, and the leverage that and the rights that we normally have or supposed to have as tenants were being really crushed by just the sheer um, lack of availability of housing, and landlords kind of had and continue to have a lot of power. The rental cap that was, passed by the government and maintained for over a year, I think almost 2 years, at 2%, and it only very recently went up to 5%. That was a lot of people's saving grace. And maintaining that rental cap, advocating for a permanent rental cap was something that I contributed to in my time as president. A permanent rental cap was something that was becoming increasingly urgent and obvious the more that we spoke to students on the ground and the more that we spoke to people in the broader community and realized, some of the homelessness that we're seeing in the broader city and the tent encampments, these issues are not just removed from the university anymore. Student housing insecurity is overlapping with what we're seeing at the tent encampments. And we did know that there were a handful of cases where students themselves were living in tents. Not at our particular university, but at other universities. There are students that were living in their cars. There are students who are packing, double capacity into a room and turning a living room or a hallway, in the most extreme cases, into a living space out of sheer desperation. So these are kind of the many different parameters and dimensions of the student housing issues that have been going on and that have really clearly emerged and been pronounced since early 2020, which is when Halifax's rental vacancy dropped to a record low of 1%, since the beginning of when that has even been measured. And it's really stayed there since. And Nova Scotia has finally committed to building some public housing. One of the things that we discovered and realized was that Nova Scotia hadn't really built public housing in over 30 years. And doing that would ease some of the pressures that other demographics, are facing with respect to the housing supply. Like, we need more public housing for, there were a lot of families and so on that were now moving into student houses and homes that were typically considered student housing before. So there were many shifted standards during this time, and slowly but surely through consistent advocacy, pressure, and mobilization of resources, these dynamics are changing.
And I don't know if it's the same for you when you were talking about the precarious situations. I know in North Bay and Northern Ontario institutions, we have like ghost landlords. Um, well, that's what we've been calling them, which is they might be different across Canada, but ghost
Yeah.
landlords. And I know I had them where our landlords would like live in. I had one that lived in Ottawa and another one that lived in Peterborough, which for those of you who don't know is a town just an hour outside of Toronto, which both of those places are about 4 hours from North Bay. So my landlords, in the times when I was renting in North Bay, I think they came I think they came to our residence about maybe once a year. So if there was
Mm,
ever an issue, you would text them and they would just tell you, go fix it. If you need money, I'll send it to you or I'll take it off your rent.
mm,
So in situations where you had an issue or if there was mold or something that needed to be done,
mhm.
you're kind of on your own. For a student, when you're the first time you're living on your own, it's kind of a daunting situation. And again, when you bring up mold,
Absolutely.
and all those kind of issues, like it's a very big thing for students that are living on their own for the first time and a big
Mhm,
big health hazard for a lot of the issues that are kind of happening
mhm,
that people don't kind of acknowledge. But that's a big one, and at least for Northern Ontario and North Bay is the ghost landlords. And when
mm,
the pandemic kind of switched over, we saw a lot of those ghost landlords pull out for a lot of reasons. They weren't in North Bay; they're 4 hours away or more. So they're
mhm.
pulling out to get their money, which is
Right.
when we saw their they're trying to get their funds out, which is when we saw a reduction in housing for students, at least where I'm from,
Right.
um, which is, I think that was when I was in the student union. So we tried to flag that to administration,
Mhm,
and they didn't think that would be a big deal. They thought they would see more landlords kind of purchase those properties, but
mm,
instead it was kind of similar to what you said that happened over in Halifax and Nova Scotia. That's when we saw more families move into what would traditionally be student properties. So
mhm.
we saw that reduction. Um, but yeah, and then students had to be crafty. We see a lot more students in North Bay kind of choosing Airbnbs as their place to be, which
Oh,
obviously
yeah.
is a lot more. I know for my last year, it was a half semester, and my other half I
Mhm.
was online. So we stayed in an Airbnb, which was a lot more expensive than it would have been for traditional rent. But a
Of
lot of
course,
people
yeah.
ended up being in hotels or motels, which was a
Mhm.
lot more expensive. But that's where the university kind of put them in because they didn't have places for them, but at least that was kind of the university's liaison because they applied for residence. They were on the wait list. They didn't get in. They had
Mhm.
nowhere else to go. So
Right.
they had deals with these hotels and motels.
Right.
They paid the same price as residents and got put into these hotels. Um, and they were quite far
Interesting.
from campus, but
Uh,
$4,000 for a half semester in a hotel. You're living luxury, but you're kind of far away. So I just was
yeah, it's a
wondering what
package.
you, yeah, it's packaged, but not the best.
Package deal.
Uh, I was wondering what you have seen from your university administrators or members of the community to try and aid in the student housing crisis. Like, what have they kind of done? I also know in North Bay, they've reached out to community members to try and rent out bedrooms. That has been one thing because we've
Mm.
seen in North Bay um, all the time. The big thing is on ads, no international students,
Mhm.
which is
Oh, oh
obviously
gosh.
that's like the worst thing that could happen, but that was always on the signs. Well, rent to anyone, just no international students, which is always the most disheartening thing. But they made works with community members that if they had students that were moving out or grandparents that just had extra rooms to try and rent out to any students, but especially to international students to try and get them a place to live. So that was kind of what
Mhm.
our institutions, so the college in North Bay and Nipissing were
Mhm.
trying to do. So what were
Yeah,
have you seen administrators tried to do in Halifax or in Nova Scotia?
right. Yeah, thank you for sharing that, and, I'd imagine did they give any further explanation as to, why no international students, or was it kind of an unspoken, like,
It was that unspoken.
reason?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, I that's been one of the pressures and, um, challenges that I've dealt with myself as an international student. I think and the it's exactly what you mentioned. It's the lack of representation that I saw in these student leadership spaces and how often international student experiences were being left out of the conversation, or international students were constantly being spoken for instead of getting to actually be representatives of their own experience. Those observations really fueled and powered by motivation to, take on the highest office in student government at Dalhousie. And I think it did make a really powerful difference in how international students viewed themselves. I had so many international students share with me just how empowering it was to see representation in this role and how much they've been taking for granted that, you know, they're not allowed to complain and they should just be grateful to be here. And there's so much emotional repression that happens. And there's so much kind of victim blaming too. There's a lot of people who shut down, the complaints that or just any sort of grievance shared by international students by saying, well, you should have done your research, you should have known, and you should have like anticipated this. But then, if these Canadian universities are going out of their way, flying halfway around the world, establishing full-on offices in the countries that they are recruiting international students from, painting this beautiful picture of what a university experience in Canada can be like, and know exactly the kind of insecurities and just dreams and aspirations to prey on. And I do use the word prey, even, by universities themselves. There's an impression and an understanding that it's only these scammy diploma mill schools that are doing that, or there's only some bad apples. But, I think we need to start acknowledging that the whole tree is actually rotten and it's not just a few bad apples. A lot of this is actually built into the very business model of the university, and even people who have a lot of empathy for this and recognize firsthand and have so much empathy for the international student experience, when they are in these administrative roles, they feel overwhelming pressure to, utilize the same business model to remain competitive with other universities across Canada, or like risk losing their job, or risk something like what happened at Laurentian University, where one of the big lessons or takeaway for the post-secondary sector was we need to focus on recruiting international students as a strategy. Neglecting that strategic focus will, send us into financial turmoil like Laurentian. And the fact that it's so explicit and it's so brazen that international students are cash cows. I've heard deans admit this, that international student tuition balances the budget, and international student tuition is the only thing that they're able to adjust flexibly to cope with the increased costs and demands of, operating a university. But not just that, it's also this, it's also the only thing that they're able to modify and adjust in order to fulfill the kind of unrelenting pace of growth that is demanded of universities and expected of universities, and that universities expect of themselves. So, given how integral international students are to the fabric of post-secondary education in Canada, we have to be talking about international students and their experience. You can't just keep like it's silly to have to kind of spell this out, but it's deeply unethical, to go out of your way to invite people here and to fix, local issues, and then say, well, you should be grateful to be here, so we get to treat you poorly and we get to push you around and do whatever we want. And certainly I've experienced so much kindness, so much grace, and I truly love the community that I found here. And still, at the same time, I want to urge caution as this country deals with a really challenging stretch with all the different crises going on right now. And sometimes, that trauma of not being able to make ends meet, it really shifts our focus inward, and it makes us focus on, us first. I had the opportunity to ask questions directly of elected officials, and when it came to the topic an issue of international students, I think the dominant kind of message that came through was that we're going to put Canadians first. And to feel like we need to meet our own needs first and we don't have enough to give away. Except the reason that immigration has been part of Canada's, strategic priorities for so long and for a while now is that the country does have an aging population and does have some significant gaps in its labor force and is a massive country for 34 million people. And it's quite sparsely populated, which leads to some inherent labor challenges that immigrants have been an important part of meeting. And so I think it's really time to retire this narrative that they're somehow, that somehow interrupting or just seizing the flow of immigrants is going to help resolve everything. And it's also important to take a less transactional view to it too, because, at the end of the day, we need all these groups to get along. And in order to get along with one another, we need to see all of us, each other as human beings with our own distinct life stories, with our own bills to pay, with our own aspirations, hopes, and goals, and so on. And sometimes when we're in crisis mode and when people are struggling to make ends meet, like they are now, that kind of broader lens can really shrink and people tend to put blinders on. But the policy decisions that get made from that kind of a perspective do not work. We've seen this time and again in a lot of different institutions. When people make decisions based off of fear, it tends to exacerbate the fear and anxiety that people have. And it tends to promote an environment where people don't trust one another and promote an environment where a high level of surveillance and resources are necessary to kind of just keep people from taking their anger out at one another. But there's some deeper relationship repair that needs to happen. And there's there's a lot of, I think, adjustments that can be made on the immigrant side and the international student community side as well. And as as a former international student myself, I think I've been well positioned to be really empathetic to the struggles that international students face, but also be firm and assertive in some of the reality checks that I'm able to offer some people, and to say, look, this is realistic and this is not realistic. And I think it's far more um, it's far better received coming from another international student who has experience than it is sometimes from when it's coming from other people who are far more privileged, and it reinforces this sense of alienation and inferiority and so on. Really, there we can talk about policy changes that need to be made all day, but until and unless there's also an underlying paradigm shift in the way that we think about one another, in the way that we think about how people's needs are met and what people's needs are, until and unless that fundamental paradigm changes and shifts, we are going to see certain limitations to the policy changes that people come up with. And, when people are locked into certain paradigms, such as believing that everyone is responsible for their own well being, everyone's responsible for their own success in life, there are certain vicious patterns that we see keep repeating. We see this attitude a lot with like um, homeless people, the unhoused who are currently inhabiting tent encampments, and anyone who's receiving any sort of welfare from the government. There's an expectation that they should figure it out themselves and that, you know, you can't spoil people with too much help and so on and so forth. When we look at all the research that shows us just how interdependent we are and how much we are wired for interdependence, I think that will lead us down a whole new path of policy changes that seemed impossible and out of reach before. And I think, looking back, that was one of the most important things that we were looking to do, and I think able to shift in really important ways, more than, giving university administrators and other decision makers perfectly packaged solutions and all the technical details of solution and exactly how to implement it. The most important thing we could do is to help prompt, and especially with the limited time that we have with the rapid turnover of student leadership, the most valuable and important thing that we were able to do was to keep shifting and pushing on that underlying mental model of what the average student is like. And I think even over the course of my time at Dalhousie, the way that professors and administrators think about the average student has changed a lot, and the way that they discuss metrics and outcomes of the ideal student experience has also changed. And those things influence exactly the way that we design policies. Like, if we don't think that someone's social life is important, then we're not going to, make any policy choices that facilitate social life on campus, and we wouldn't see any of the vibrancy that we now have. In similar ways, a lot of the solutions for the housing crisis exist. And my experience at the Dalhousie Student Union, as well as, on the ground as a residence assistant and all the other leadership roles that I've had the opportunity to be in, um, the most kind of overwhelming barrier towards change is that underlying paradigm and ideology, which seems all but invisible until somebody's perspective is there to interrupt it. And that's why listening to student perspectives is non-negotiable, is fundamental to implementing solutions for student housing, and listening to a variety of different perspectives, and hearing from international students as well as domestic students, hearing from low income students as well as higher income students, listening to stories about people who are stuck in or just recently got out of abusive relationships, um, because domestic abuse was rampant, particularly during the pandemic, and much harder to escape. And that puts particular pressures on somebody that they may not be able to openly disclose. You know, for everyone from the outside looking in, they might seem like they're perfectly well equipped to be um, housed and to have all their needs met. But there are underlying struggles that are going on that not everyone has the safety to talk about yet. So listening is the most important, and there aren't really shortcuts around that, unfortunately. And every opportunity that I got to listen to students enriched my ability to serve them that much more. So, for anyone listening to this who is in any sort of decision making role, and has the ability to influence responses to really complex issues, there's only so much that you'll grasp by reading about it. Nothing really replaces or substitutes for being there, you know, in the heart of the issue, and listening to people's direct experiences with it. And seeing people embody the contradictions and the complexities and the nuances that can only, be reflected so much on a media article or a journal article and various other, literature.
Yeah. And I want to, you said something a little while ago that I wanted to re-highlight, which was you're talking about in your time at Dalhousie, they shifted policy to focus more on student experience. And I think that's something that a lot of universities don't focus on. And I know my university, they focus it again near the later parts of my years there. They also shifted to focus it on a bit more. Um, it comes to Maslow's hierarchy. Um, a lot of times we try to make sure that the basic needs are met, the bottom layer, which is food and shelter and warmth.
Mhm.
And if students have that needs met, they're good, they're golden, they can go to school, they can succeed. But really, not really. They have to get everything met. And in the podcast we did with Tejan, we kind of talked about culture. And so it's not just for international students. A lot of students, BIPOC students, really need that culture met. And where I am from in North Bay, it's predominantly white. And so when we have our BIPOC students that come there, when we have our international students come there, they're really isolated. And so
Mhm.
when New Base got formed, and for those who've listened to that podcast, it was formed after the death of George Floyd, and with the release of that. So if you hadn't listened to that, go listen to that. But the students there really wanted the culture to formation there because it was missing at in Nipissing. Um, and so at a lot of universities, like the culture isn't there for some of these students. Um, and so what they don't have that they can't really succeed. Some of them have that basic layer met, but they don't have the other layers, so they can't really succeed
Mhm.
in their studies. And with the student housing crisis, we don't even have that bottom layer met. So
Mhm.
a lot of educators I find don't have that empathy for students. Even if they have that bottom layer met,
Yeah.
they don't really have that empathy for students. So they're
Mhm.
just it kind of gets pushed aside and really the empathy or the focus gets put on studies. Um,
Mhm.
and I don't know, you email your professor when you have that really hard time, and it's just kind of like, nope, focus on that assignment, focus on that test coming up. But
Mhm.
when everything kind of piles up and you just need that break, um,
Mhm.
I feel like instructors really need to have that layer of empathy for students,
Yeah.
especially even though the pandemic's been almost 4 years removed since the day it started.
Yeah.
Everything's been it's
Literally
been
4
building up.
years.
It's a snowball effect. Um,
Mhm.
it feels so long ago, but everything has snowballed from it. That I
Mhm.
think the faculty members, administrators, they still need to have that layer of empathy that they didn't have they had so in 2020, 2021, that they still kind of need to carry over and they continue to that they need to continue to have
Mhm.
because those issues aren't going away. Like the housing crisis isn't going to go away, the food insecurity isn't going to go away. All
Mhm.
those other issues won't be going away anytime soon until change
Mhm.
is met, so that empathy needs to keep continuing to happen. Do
Yeah.
you have any other advice or words of guidance for instructors or administrators for students that are facing these issues?
No, I do have guidance, but I first wanted to just acknowledge how great the points that you brought up were, and um, just bringing up, Maslow's hierarchy and just these other needs that are compelling and that are necessary, especially given the expectations and standards that we hold our students to,
Hmm.
And there are a lot of academics and instructors who've been talking about just a level of just a drop in the level of standards and outcomes that their students are achieving that they've never seen before in their careers. I remember seeing one instructor within our university share that, you know, the attendance level in her class, which was typically a very popular class, had dropped to a low that she had never seen before in her like 30-year career. And while her initial reaction was to feel like it was a personal failure and that it was like really like really crushing her morale, um, she clearly, worked through that emotion to recognize all of the different circumstances and situations that are influencing student behavior and student outcomes in the classroom. And, I want to say there's a particular kind of instructor that is likely to even be listening to this, and a particular kind of administrator that is likely to even be listening to this, and its full kind of um, length. And I just want to say that people like you were my just pillars during my time in student leadership and as a student myself. I see you. There's a lot of students that see you and are so deeply grateful for you. And I know that it's not enough for, these individual saviors and individual heroes to take on so much and to take on the gaps in this massive system. And as much as I burned out from, trying to fix various issues within the system, I also saw and had so much empathy for, faculty members that were burning out, trying to make up for huge resource gaps and support gaps, knowing the complexity of the issues that students are facing, and they were showing up. And one of the criticisms that I have, and one of the recommendations I would pose to universities at large as a system is how well are you rewarding these instructors? If we're all talking about the kind of empathy that we need to see in universities, how well are we actually rewarding empathy? How well are we actually supporting people to show up and experience their full range of emotions? Because in my experience, a lot of the time we reward people who aren't in touch with their emotions, who are able to carry on, like machines, and work with this machine like numbness in order to keep up a certain level of productivity. And that productivity is prioritized first and foremost above anything else. And so the people who the system retains the most, and the people who keep succeeding and keep being rewarded within academia, but in a lot of different spaces too, are the people who are going to tell you, you need to buckle up, and you need to still get your assignment done. You can only get an extra day. Oh, I'm sorry that your, grandparents died. When can you get this done? I think we've seen what, you know, practicing that level of rigidity in our lives can do when disaster strikes, the way it did during the pandemic. And we saw just how fragile our systems were because we, work everyone to full capacity as much as possible. What if we questioned what it means to succeed in academia? What if we questioned the ideal of getting in and out of university and getting into the workforce as soon as possible, which is one of the pressures that a lot of students face, and it's student leaders who often take on, the labor of doing important work to help make student life more conducive for success for the next kind of generation of students, but they get penalized for it in a lot of different ways. And um, you talked about going to the teaching profession earlier and how it feels like it's you're giving a lot more out than you are taking, and we each are ultimately the only people who can save ourselves. We don't need other people to save us. However, we do need support and company and help, and there is still an interdependence. So, you know, um, ultimately, the best work that people can do is to set up the system, the overall system, to actually support the best interests of the people that it purportedly supports. That is how we get lasting change. That is how we ensure that, the safety and security and stability of a number of people is not contingent on one person's mental health and burnout cycles, because burnout will happen. And that person who's experiencing burnout will not have the opportunity to fully recover and might just be in a permanent state of burnout, like I was, for most of my time as a student leader because I felt like I wasn't allowed to rest. There's too much to be done. And if I let go, who's going to take over? The power in numbers is something that we desperately need. And another message I would say is I wish that, we stopped dividing ourselves as like, oh, this person's an advocate, this person's an activist, just for voicing concerns and so on. Um, we don't just need advocates and activists to speak on our behalf. One of the best things that we can do is to all learn to speak on our behalf and be more aware of each other's struggles and positionality. We've talked about the importance of advocacy and activism and sustained, persistent advocacy and activism, which is only possible through, you know, strength in numbers and through having, people who can rotate through it. And it happens when we interrogate the idea that only, some of us are experts about certain issues. We all have expertise in various areas. We all have lived experience, and we all are experts of our own lives. Um, and we have the capacity to connect with and be in community with people. And it's so important that if we are advocating on behalf of people, that we are in community with them and regularly hearing from them. The work to do all of this is so often, you know, not rewarded enough. A big part of it is because it's very feminized. Emotional labor isn't given the weight that it's actually worth and isn't rewarded in the same ways that certain more masculinized traits would be, because we do need to acknowledge that we live in a patriarchal society, and we need to acknowledge the systems of oppression that seem to be seamlessly blended into the background to the point where we're not even able to perceive it at times because that's all we know. And so critical thinking and being aware of systems of oppression and being able to interrogate our most basic fundamental assumptions about one another and what it means to live a good life. These are some of the things that are really at the heart of driving some of the most effective systems change. Um, you know, um, a lot of the time we prioritize this negative piece where there's no outright conflict, but everyone exists at a high level of tension. And at any moment, somebody will explode, but they're always just teetering on the edge. And that's seen as, you know, a metric or a sign of success because we've avoided open conflict. But what if, we took a longer term view to relationships and systems in general and the ways in which they serve us, and we thought about the fact that, well, if we do address this head on, risk, an open conflict, a potential argument, might we arrive at more understanding with one another by the end of this and see each other in a whole new way because we were each holding back things that we thought would make us unrelatable, but actually we have a lot more in common than we thought, and that fundamentally shifts our mental model of what the conflict was even about. It Conflict actually affords people the ability to put their assumptions out in the open and often change the way that they understand one another. But doing all of this work and being aware of all of this, there's a lot of different places that just aren't paying enough for this, right? And it seems far easier just to use force to deal with it. And one of the ways that we're seeing, municipal governments across Canada deal with tent encampments and the conflict that has exposed between, the housed neighbors and residents within the community, as well as the inhabitants and residents of the tent encampments, that conflict between the two of them, which can be an opportunity for deepening a relationship if they, are able to meet with one another and meet as equals and talk to one another. We're instead seeing, and here in Halifax, we're currently going through and seeing forced evictions and people having all of their worldly possessions just seized, destroyed. And a lot of these people are being displaced for the umpteenth time in the middle of what's been a very turbulent winter. The lack of empathy for people who are living in tents in the middle of winter, and this assumption that they must have, like, they're choosing to live in tents in the middle of winter has been astounding and just heartbreaking to witness. But it comes from this idea that, well, like, talking things out, like, that's impossible. We could never understand each other. We could never, see eye to eye. Those are some of the assumptions that inform the policy decisions that are made. So the personal is political and the political is personal in a lot of different ways. And I'll end with, that book recommendation, especially, I think it's worthwhile and valuable for everybody. And hopefully, in this lifetime, we will see this kind of labor recognized and rewarded fully for how important it actually is and how life-saving and life-sustaining it is. But in the meantime, I recommend the book Burnout: The Secret to Unlocking the Stress Cycle by Emily Nagoski and Amelia Nagoski. And it is an excellent resource, I think, for a lot of people who are, especially in any sort of caregiving space, who are dealing with traumatic, you know, um, issues all the time. And because of their own burnout, can often become more harmful than helpful, despite their absolute best intentions.
Yeah, that's a good one
Sorry,
too
I think
for
you're gonna
oh,
say
nice.
something.
Oh, I was gonna say that's a good one too. For like good for student leaders, good for admin, good for faculty. But I think we also don't think of staff for universities because those are students we liaise with them all the time, and we don't think of them
Mm-hmm.
getting burnt out because a lot of things get piled on to their desk.
Oh
And
yeah.
they're the ones that we deal with in the finance office. We deal with them in the student housing office. They're the ones that are finding us places to live. In residence, and they get burnt out a lot too. So that's a good one. So they're not quick to make judgment, quick to send a short response that a student might interpret the wrong way. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so that's a good one for them too, for those that are listening. Um, I am going to end the final part of the podcast are just two questions that we've been asking all interviewees
Mm-hmm.
across all media platforms. Then it's just to tie
Mm-hmm.
things together, and it's just going to serve as a nice summary for our conversation today. And it's just, in your opinion, what is the most important challenge currently facing higher education today? Um, yeah.
There's a lot of different challenges in higher education, but the one that stands out to me the most is equity and access, particularly on socioeconomic lines. And by that, I mean, university is just getting more and more expensive and only increasingly accessible to a very privileged, small, elite group. And knowing how beneficial university education is and the wonders that it really does for people's ability to think critically and be informed about the world, and their surroundings and the ways in which it equips people for um, being, productive members of society. This just exacerbates inequality in society and just creates a larger and larger gap that is going to get harder and harder to manage. And we know that a lot of the issues that universities try to address and that various institutions and stakeholders try to address are usually symptoms of the same shared problem, which is that tuition is taking up so much of everyone's disposable income, um, of everyone's just costs, that there's not enough left over to buy textbooks. There's not enough left over to, manage rent increases or manage emergency situations. And with each year that passes and with each year that, tuition rises higher and higher, we get a lot of really well-intentioned people who are working away at addressing these symptoms, such as, um, you know, expensive textbooks, for example, by implementing a bursary specifically for that, by creating scholarships specifically for that, and so on and so forth. There does come a point, and I think we're seeing it already, where there is so much to manage and there's way too much going on at a university for, you know, the university to be accountable for this much. And so much of that responsibility, wouldn't need to be managed if a university education fundamentally was just more accessible and was just more affordable and didn't cost tens of thousands of dollars in debt, to um, domestic students, or $250,000 for international students. And you know, um, in the case of international students and housing and broader issues within the country, I think I'm seeing a very, very concerning kind of force feeding of really provocative headlines and stories that antagonize international students and really pit them and their issues at the expense of average Canadians. And I don't deny that there are conflicts between domestic students, residents, and international students that need to be addressed. But the media coverage and kind of the relentless antagonization of it, and when politicians also give in to that characterization, can cause deep rifts that become very, very difficult to then resolve. And I would really urge caution around that characterization and would urge universities to push back on that kind of messaging as much as possible for the future of and the sake of post-secondary education as we know it.
Well, thank you so much. And it's really been a great pleasure talking with you today. And it's been a really great conversation. And I think about the impact of student housing on our students. And I really think that the listeners here, they've taken a lot from it. And hopefully that they can better support students and make some policy changes and find better ways to help them with either housing or help them with their studies and either creating bursaries or finding ways to support them. So, really great conversation. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for your time.